Welcome to another episode of the BS Podcast, the show that looks at how behavioural change insights are being applied in the wild. Episodes feature renowned behavioural experts across industries and organisations, from management and marketing to policy and public health, and more. Let's dive in and see what all the BS is about. Here's your host from The Behaviourist, Nick Hobson.
Richard is a highly experienced practitioner, speaker, and writer on behavioral science and business, with a focus on communications and technology. He is currently VP of BVA Nudge Unit UK, the founder of the consultancy Communication Science Group, and a board member of the Association for Business Psychology. He's been featured on BBC Radio and in HR Magazine, delivered training at Google, and guest lectured for City University and Cass Business School. Over his career, Richard has successfully addressed behavioral challenges as varied as getting people to stop smoking, to join the armed forces, this might be my favorite, to drink spirits rather than wine, to turn up to school, pay for the university tuition, submit taxes, buy flatback furniture, and take public transit, just to name a few. Previously, Richard co-developed the first training program for behavior change communications at the COI in 2010, and since then has conducted training for call center personnel, marketing directors, press officers, media planners, creatives, and everything in between. He's a frequent conference speaker and now works as a consultant for major brands, including HSBC and Southeastern Railways. And most exciting is the release of his new book, just this week, actually, called The Behavior Business, Why Every Business Needs to Understand Behavior to Succeed. So, Richard, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
And as I said, it's a big week for you.
It is, yes.
Congratulations. It's
Thank you.
Very exciting. So that seems to be a good place to start. So I checked it out. I haven't had the chance, total disclosure, I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I'm excited to dig in. So, there's some taglines that appear in the materials and on the book covers, so things like, quote, if you are in business, you are in the business of behavior. And, quote, what people do is often not the same as what they say or intend to do, which of course we know. And if that's anywhere that, people need to be aware of that, it's in organizations and businesses. And yet that is sort of a new thing in the last, decade or so, I think.
Yeah.
So, why don't you just tell us a little bit about the rationale for writing the book, why you wanted to do it, and how the whole process sort of went for you?
Yeah, sure. So, exactly as you say, I think, one of the things that sort of struck me in my work, and I've spent I guess, whether I knew it or not, I spent the last kind of 15 years applying behavioral science in one way, shape, or another, is that there are lots of things that businesses do that kind of go against the evidence base that we now have around human behavior and what those drivers and influences of human behavior are, as those people like yourselves who work in the field of behavioral science know. There's an awful lot of things that we do that ignore that fact that, as you say, what people say is often not the same as what they intend to do or what they actually do. And for me, that was really kind of puzzling and something that obviously I've been trying to address in my work for a number of years. But also in terms of how my sort of entry point into behavioral science, if you like, my gateway drug for behavioral science to a certain extent was around was working in public sector, where unusually, I guess, behavioral science is one of the fields where the public sector has kind of been leading the way in terms of the application of behavioral insights and effectively changing behavior at scale. And for me, that started, as I say, about 15 years ago when I was working for the Department of Health in the UK, and I was working on anti-smoking campaigns. So we were doing all these kind of a fairly traditional approach of really scary ads with pictures of diseased lungs and those kind of things, the kind of shock tactics that were kind of mainstay of those campaigns sort of across the world, really. And we reached a point where, to be honest, the efficacy of that was limited and it was dwindling. And what we did was we worked with an external consultant called Kate Waters, who's a brilliant ad planner, who now works for the UK's largest commercial broadcaster, ITV, and and she has a psychology background, and she started working with us at the tobacco campaign and started bringing all these insights, particularly from social psychology, around that we could use for the campaign. And for me, firstly, that was incredibly interesting and an area that I didn't really know much about. My academic background is actually in law, so so I didn't have a huge grounding in any of that in psychology of any type, really.
And just so we're placing it sort of in the timeline of things, what year would this have been roughly?
About 2005, actually, yeah. So
Okay.
2004,
Okay. Good.
2005,
Yep. Yep.
and it marks a real shift in our approach, and the new marketing strategy that we employed was much more focused on actually um, providing. Well, there was two things that happened. There was one very successful campaign which had been funded by the department, but it was actually run by a charity called BHF, which was called the Fatty Cigarettes campaign, which was actually about linking the act of smoking itself with the long-term consequences more directly, effectively trying to create a kind of Pavlovian disgust mechanism
Mm.
around cigarettes. And the creative itself, I mean, it's actually very literally disgusting in that the campaign itself showed people smoking, and as they smoked, um, fatty deposits would come out of their cigarette in the same way that ash does out of a cigarette. But
Mm.
they were these horrible kind of fatty looking deposits, which is effectively is what's happening in your arteries as you smoke a cigarette. And that was, and the insight behind that was around that Kate had developed was around um, that creating that Pavlovian response, creating that linking of a kind of disgusting consequence of smoking with the act of smoking itself.
Mm.
And that was very interesting, and that was why one of the reasons we got her involved in the campaign more generally. But actually, what she brought to the campaign as well was the understanding that in behavioural terms, what we needed to do was to facilitate the behaviour change, effectively give more self-efficacy to smokers, give them confidence in their ability to quit, and also emphasize more, less about the why of quitting smoking and more about the how to quit smoking successfully.
Mm.
Because of the legacy, as in most of the Western world, certainly of sort of 40 years of anti-smoking campaigns, everyone who smokes now knows it's bad for them and now knows about the harm it's doing. But actually, what they find difficult is the act of quitting itself and the change of behaviour in terms of going from being a smoker to being a non-smoker. And so what we did was the campaign put as much resources and effort into promoting the mechanisms to help people quitting smoking. Obviously, with the public healthcare system in the UK via the NHS, there's lots of services and subsidies for things like nicotine replacement therapy and so on that people could use. And so we put our focus and our emphasis on that, and that proved to be incredibly successful. And for me, that was the light bulb moment. There was really one that actually this approach was more effective or cost effective in achieving the overall policy outcome, which was encouraging people to quit smoking or getting more people off cigarettes, if you like. And the second was that that was fueled by this understanding of some of the irrationalities of human behaviour, and smoking is in many ways the quintessential irrational behaviour because everyone knows it's bad for them, but people still do it. So so that for me was a real insight. And then when I went back to work in the private sector again, and I started looking at some of the challenges and working on some of the challenges that private sector clients were talking to us about, I realized that kind of understanding of the irrationalities of human behavior and some of the insights that behavioral science gives us around that could be equally be applied to some of those challenges, but also that frequently businesses were operating on the basis of consumers being or customers being very much in that being very rational, being in the system 2 spotlight mode when they're assessing products and whether to purchase products and services. And obviously everything that behavioral science was telling me from the additional research and learning that I'd done around this was that was complete nonsense. And so I guess one of the inspirations for writing the book was recognizing that actually that understanding of those irrational drivers or the non-rational, I should say, drivers of behavior are as applicable and as useful and as relevant to the challenges facing modern businesses as they are in the public sector. But as I say, they're actually being less frequently applied, I would say, than they are in the public sector. So there's a lot we could learn from the approach.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So a few questions follow up. Do you in the UK are those those shocking, disgusting pictures that are on the cover of cigarette packages?
Mm.
Are they still used in the
Yes,
UK?
they are.
Okay, so
Yeah,
they
they
are
are.
still in Canada as well, and I think they probably sort of released them in around the same time, which would have been 2005 ish, if I'm trying to think back in here in Canada. But I learned, which is really interesting. So two things: one, I'd be curious to see the like sort of the actual efficacy of those anti-smoking campaigns,
Yeah.
and eliciting the sense of disgust as a psychological targeted approach. But two, what's interesting, I learned from another guest on the show was that in the U.S., and this might be state by state and legislation, that they haven't had those on their
Mm.
packages, and they're just now, I think, in some or many states releasing them. So it's interesting that we've had them in the UK and Canada for 10, 15 years plus. Do you know? Do you know the efficacy of those, of specifically the discussed elicitation?
Yeah, well, I mean, so I was working on the campaigns team, so we weren't actually involved in the regulatory aspects around, what tobacco companies can do and what they're allowed to put on the packaging, or any of the mandated
Mm,
warnings that they have to put on the packages. Our work was all about, um, you know, advertising, marketing campaigns that were trying to change behaviour. What's often referred to as social marketing, I guess.
mm,
And um and so um i yeah i wasn't as involved directly as involved in that. I know that in particular, so one really interesting thing for me was in 2012 when I moved to Australia, and I was heading up strategy for federal government. There was that, obviously, as in many parts of the world, smoking was the biggest preventable cause of death in Australia, as it was in other countries. But actually Australia had kind of been leading the way to a certain extent in their anti-tobacco measures,
mm,
and a lot of the evidence base and research around some of the policy measures, like the pack warnings, was is from Australia for that reason, because they'd
mm,
actually had the pack warnings on their cigarettes for much longer than they had been in the UK, certainly. And one of the things that came in when I was in Australia, from a policy intervention, um, which has now been adopted in the UK as well, which I do know there is a very strong evidence base around, is not only the pack warnings but also plain packaging on cigarettes, and also the so enforcing, so removing the ability for cigarette manufacturers to put branding on their cigarettes.
mm,
Um, and also the other measure around that is that cigarettes now have to be, this is true in the UK as well now, they have to be placed in behind a locked cabinet with no visible branding or any markings on it, other than to say, cigarettes. Um, and that, I believe, has been very effective. Just
yeah,
simply
yeah.
removing that, if you like, that visual nudge, and the
Mm,
branding and the attractive colors and so on, that the cigarette companies use to market their products, um, has been very effective, which is really interesting in itself. I think, in terms of it's kind of perversely is a good evidence base for marketing more generally.
yeah.
If we know that by stripping away branding and marketing and some of the semiotics that are used to signify certain brands, and this is very interesting to me, particularly where I now work, being a market research agency who do a lot of work around branding and packaging. That by removing all of that from the cigarette companies, you actually make the product much less desirable.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and so that was very interesting to me when I moved to Australia, and seeing that had been in place for a few years, and it did seem to be working.
Yeah, I think in Canada about 8 years ago they did the initiative with putting it behind, which is such an obvious like intervention point. A person goes to a gas station, they fill up gas, or they pick up some milk and they're paying for it, and the thing that's like staring them right in the face is just a wall of cigarettes.
Mm.
And if they're a smoker or casual smoker, and they say, "Oh, what's going to come to mind is, do I have cigarettes? Do I want cigarettes? Oh, maybe I do," and then they make that decision. Where versus actually covering them up with what we have here is just this gray case that sort of flips open so that the store clerk can get access to them. But that
Mm.
just seems like it. When I remember thinking about it, I was like, yeah, that seems so obvious and such a right step, a step in the right direction.
Yeah, it's a great way to add friction, I guess. We talk
Yes,
about
yeah, exactly.
we a lot of the work that I do and is around cognitive ease and trying to remove friction and trying to make things easy for people as possible. And actually, it's a great example of how by doing the opposite, you can in preventing an undesirable behavior,
Hmm.
you can achieve a great impact.
Yeah, and we are here in Canada as well, and to some extent in the actually yes, in the U.S. and Canada, sort of wrestling with these regulatory battles around e-cigarettes with companies
Mm.
like Juul and like talk about like branding as there was no regulation whatsoever. So I think it was sort of this weird legislative gray zone when these products came to market a few years ago, we didn't really know the lasting impacts, and so these companies just went, had their heyday, and they were calling their products like fuzzy peach, and the coloring that they were using and the naming and just their overall branding was appealing, and was appealing in particular to young teenagers, to young kids, which was problematic. So now, yeah, we're seeing, I suspect in the next 6 months to a year, all of that is going to be changed, and e-cigarettes there's going to be the same, stringent regulations as there are with regular, plain cigarettes. um Another thing that comes to mind, I don't know if you saw this week or maybe last week, was the new Burger King
Yes, I was just
ad.
thinking about that actually. Yeah,
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 yeah.
yeah,
So this is a fascinating. I'd love to get your take on this because
yeah.
here we're talking about disgust, we're talking about shock, and I've seen other, like, one that comes to mind is a few years ago there was here we have the WSIB, workplace safety something. It's sort of the regulatory body to ensure that organizations and workplaces are safe for workers and employees. And there was this one ad where it's a person who's working in a kitchen, and they drop, because it's an unsafe work environment, they stumble and fall and trip, and a pot of boiling water falls on their face, and they showed it like this, like, person's like melting face. It was super shock and awe, right?
Yeah.
And so we know that works. We see it with cigarettes. We know that disgust as an emotion, as a very primitive basic emotion, leads to a sense of avoidance, or like, our nose goes up, we close our nasal cavity, we close our eyes, because we don't want whatever the pathogen or whatever the thing that's dangerous to us to enter into our body. So it's a complete avoidance response when we see that type of stimulus. Now, here is Burger King intentionally eliciting a sense of disgust in, in their audience, in their potential customer and consumer. And so everyone's talking, is this going to create a backfire effect such that when they think of the BK Whopper, all they're going to think about is this disgusting,
Mm,
moldy, gross looking burger. And
mm.
I'm not going to want to go to BK to get that burger. I don't know. What do
Yeah,
you think?
no, absolutely, absolutely. I think, yeah, it's a very real prospect. I think that backfire effect. I mean, yeah, you talk about those kind of shocking ads and public safety campaigns. So, when I worked at the COI, so subsequently to working at the Department of Health, I went to work for the COI, which is called the Central Office of Information, which is a very Orwellian title, but it was actually used to be the Ministry of Information, which was established in the Second World War here in the UK. And
Mm,
so effectively the propaganda department, but subsequent to the Second World War, it then became mainly about public safety and
mm,
public health campaigns. And it famously ran a number of campaigns and ads, particularly during the 70s and 80s, which people still talk about now for being particularly traumatic memories from their childhood. There was one I tweeted about it today because someone posted a link to it that I'd forgotten about. I remember watching when I was must have been about 7 or 8 years old, and it was about a group of kids playing on a farm, and they all meet incredibly grisly deaths as a result of this farm equipment. And it was designed exactly to kind of to scare kids and to say, to prevent the behavior. I think what's interesting about this Burger King campaign and the linking it to the tobacco work I was talking about. One of the things that we found, and again, one of the drivers of us sort of changing the approach for the anti-smoking work that we were doing in the UK, and then also when I was in Australia, was that in the research we were finding quite a lot of reactance, as in that there were a lot of smokers who because they had seen so many of these kind of visceral warnings about the dangers of cigarettes, and seen these shocking ads, or had seen the pack warnings with pictures of diseased lungs and so on them, that actually it was creating a reactance amongst people. In the Yes, there was that initial disgust around it, but it was also very much hardening their views around smoking. In some cases, it was also almost making some smokers more determined to continue smoking despite that evidence base. Or the other thing that happens is you have such a visceral response to the immediacy of those images that they just completely disassociate from it or switch off. I mean, literally in terms of TV ads, for example, that you see, once you've seen the ad once, the next time it comes on, you'll flip the channel. And that was one reason why we realized that, again, the change of approach was needed. But it's with the Burger King ad, I think absolutely, for me, it's a very strange move, because it is a very rational message in some ways. There is an immediate emotional response to the ad, which is a disgust, as you say, when you see the moldy burger. But the message that sits behind that is a very rational one, which is to say, well, the only reason it goes moldy is because we don't put preservatives in it. Therefore, it's a better quality product than McDonald's or any other burger chain. And to me, that's not really, the nature of consumption of this particular product, and this particular category is pretty system one, I would say. I mean, I experienced this myself earlier this week, where I had a limited window to get something to eat before I had to get my train home. And in the station where I get my train, there is a Burger King and a McDonald's. And the funny thing was I'd actually seen this ad a bit earlier in the week, and to my mind, to be honest, the Burger Kings and the McDonald's that exist in train stations are not the best Burger King and McDonald's branches that you could go to. In fact, I have a good friend who got very, very severe food poisoning from a Burger King in a station, and was hospitalized. And ever since then, it's kind of given me pause for thought before I consider going to them again. And so in this particular case, I was like, well, yeah, sure, Burger King might not use as many preservatives, but given the environment I'm in a train station, I'll probably go to the one that uses the preservatives, because frankly, I'm less likely to get sick. So I think, and there's a very good logic around this. I mean, Rory Sutherland, who wrote the foreword for my book, who's a good friend of mine and a real sort of inspiration, in the two people who inspired me in terms of my work in behavioral science more than anyone else, so Kate Waters, who I mentioned earlier, and Rory. He has a great phrase about McDonald's, where he says, in purely kind of psychological terms, McDonald's is the best restaurant in the world, because it's from a choice satisficing solution. As a choice satisficing solution, it ticks all the boxes. There's a reason why there are McDonald's all around the world. And when, as a tourist, for example, from the UK or from Canada or the US, if you're in a strange land and you don't understand the language, and maybe you've had your fill of the local food, there probably is going to be one day on your vacation, or when you're backpacking, where you go to McDonald's, because you just want the easy option. You want the choice satisficing solution in terms of something that is exactly is familiar, is not going to make you sick, and will give you the nutrients that you need. And so from in purely psychological terms, one could argue that as a choice satisficing solution, McDonald's is perfect in that sense. And I think, and that just goes to show that I think fundamentally the choices that are made about, these are not gourmet restaurants, they are quick service restaurants. The drivers of people to purchase from them are going to be quite system one based, I would say. And so putting out an ad which elicits that very visceral emotional response to it is undermining quite a lot of those drivers, I think.
Yeah, that's a good interpretation, which I don't realize I probably thought about, is their underlying assumption with the ad, being effective or working, is that people are pausing, taking the time to sort of override that initial system one automatic disgust response and say, that's gross. That sort of makes me concerned. However, the reason I'm concerned is because, well, there's no preservatives, and that's actually a good thing in sort of the slow food movement, and people are more conscious of what the types of foods, and so therefore, you know what, I like it, I'm going to go get a Whopper. I think that's just, it's probably giving too much credit to the lay person and the average consumer who's making a quick
Absolutely.
decision to get just a fast food burger at this moment right now.
Yeah,
But so
absolutely.
it's an empirical question, and I'm sure there's a lot of behavioral scientists and ad people who are standing by waiting to see if there's a rise or a drop in the number of Whopper purchases in the next 2 months or so. So we'll have to keep on top of that to see how it does, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, if I worked for Burger King, I wouldn't be holding my breath.
Yeah, exactly. I want to know whose neck is on the chopping block for if this goes bad. I would have loved to see whoever was the creative who came into the office sitting around the table and go, oh, I have an idea.
Well, it's interesting that, because it's something I do touch on in the book about how there is a bit of a, and certainly my experience, having come from the marketing and media world, is that there is a real bias within the industry, which is around, we often talk about ads for ad people. And and this, I think one of the things that one of the key criticisms of this campaign is that it feels like it's an ad that's been made for ad people,
Mm.
not for the consumer. I mean, in Richard Shotton, a quote that he gave me from my book is that he says that, if you saw someone in the supermarket um, assessing brands of shampoo, on a purely rational level, and sitting there or standing in the aisle in the supermarket, assessing them for price, quality, all of these things, you'd think that person was insane. None of us have the time to do that, or the cognitive ability to do that, even if we wanted to. By necessity, most of the purchase decisions we make, are very much choice satisficing.
Mhm.
And so, if we recognise that, then ultimately it's going to be far more effective to influence those system one drivers of purchase, if you want to grow your brands.
Mhm.
And so, and unfortunately, the people who work in the ad industry are spending, you know, 35 hours or more a week thinking about one brand in particular. They are likely to be choice maximizers in their category.
Mhm.
So one thing I advocate in the book is that possibly if you run a marketing department, one of the most useful things you can do is to put a massive sign on the wall saying you are not the target audience,
Mhm.
because ultimately we're not. Those of us who work in marketing, we have to recognize that actually for most people, all they want are to make easy, good enough decisions for most of the purchases they make, and our
Mhm.
job is to facilitate that.
Mhm. That's a great point, and it reminds me of Steven Pinker talks a lot about it. He's a cognitive scientist, cognitive
Mm.
neuroscientist who worked with Noam Chomsky. Now he's big sort of in the field now, and he talks about the curse of knowledge, and he
Mm.
applies it not obviously not in the context of ad agencies, but more in the context of how we communicate and how we write, in particular in professional services, legal services, and academia,
Yes.
and how here we have, probably the smartest people, in these organizations and in these firms and in university institutions, and yet they're just terrible communicators because they assume that the audience to whom they're communicating, writing, and speaking has the same level of understanding and comprehension and
Absolutely.
knowledge, and they
Yeah.
just don't. That's a fact, and so I think that's just a different version of what you're saying with,
Mm.
you are not your target audience, especially, and that's a great point you raised, is like, you live and breathe this one brand. If you're part of that organization, that's all you see all the time, and so it's something that I think is really important for these people who work in these organizations to know and to recognize. So let's shift a little bit. Let's go into organizations, because it seems that's where a lot of your thinking is, and just talking about the book. It's there's this importance of getting business, leaders and organizations at large to quote unquote understand behavior.
Mm.
So my question for you, and sort of the position that you have taken in the book and the work that you do with BVA Nudge, is what do you think the best way is to do that, to understand behavior? Because I think I think organizations have been implicitly thinking about this for a very long time. It's just nowadays in the last decade, we have a framework, we have a nomenclature, we have words, we have methodologies, we have very popular books that are coming out. Before it was personality tests and, like the bunk design of Myers-Briggs. And now we're talking about BE and behavioral insights and behavioral science. And then there's design thinking. So yeah, all of that that's going on and has been going on for some time. What is the best way to get leaders and organizations to quote unquote understand behavior?
Yeah, it's a really good point, or a really good question. So, from my perspective, I think, yeah, absolutely. The fact that we now have this great evidence base and we have so many resources and as you say, nomenclature around behavioral science and these drivers of behavior and a better understanding of it. One of the things I say in the book is we've learned more in the last 50 years about human behavior than we had in the previous 5,000.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the discipline of psychology itself is barely 100 years old. So, we kind of it's new science, if you like, a lot of it, but there is a lot around that we can learn from, and there are great academics out there who have done amazing work that certainly I've learned a lot from, and I guess one of the key points to mention at this stage is I get introduced at conferences and things as a behavioral scientist, and I really do kind of bristle a little bit at that, not because I don't want to be, but because I'm a practitioner. My work has all been around taking these insights and the work that the academics and other practitioners have been doing and applying that. And one of the reasons, when I wrote the book, that one of the things I did in writing the book was I went out and spoke to 25 leading practitioners, both behavioral scientists and not, in different aspects of business to get their views on the relevance and the role for behavioral science. So, the reason I wanted to do that was because I wanted to learn from other people and make sure that I was reflecting that best practice. So a simple solution to that challenge, as you say, is to learn from the best practice that's out there and to work with leading experts and practitioners. And obviously, I'm going to plug the work of companies like the one I work for, in terms of what we do. But there are lots of great practitioners out there doing great work. I think the other aspect of it, and this is the kind of second theme of my book, I guess, if you like, is that I prefer to, or I use the term behavioral science rather than behavioral economics or social psychology and so on, because firstly, it's beneficial to think of it as being a collection of disciplines, I think, rather than one discipline in particular. As in, there's lots we can learn from various aspects of the social sciences in terms of understanding human behavior. But also, the other side of it is that science word. And for me, one of the insights for me, and one of the things that I talk about in the book, is that a scientific approach and being scientific in the approach to applying behavioral insights is really, really critical. And what I mean by that is really adopting the approach of testing and learning and optimizing, and recognizing as part of that, you have to recognize what you don't know as much as you do know. So as in, the reason for experimentation is to verify your hypotheses, to verify something you think might be true based on the existing evidence base, based on on work of other practitioners, and then to verify that through experimentation. And that's the other critical aspect to me in terms of, if you're applying behavioral science, it's not sufficient to go, oh, we see Netflix are using social norms as a way of getting people to watch more content on Netflix. Therefore, let's use social norms in everything that we do. Because I know from my own experience that actually there are some contexts in which social norms have severe backfire effects, and I've seen it for myself.
Mm-hmm.
So the most critical thing is that you take that hypothesis and you test it, and you test it using actual data on behavior as much as possible. And that's as much about the behavior within organizations as it is the behavior of your target, whoever that might be. And I talk about in the book what I call test tube behaviors, and that's both the application of behavioral science and the latest thinking on that, but also as an organization recognizing that to successfully apply behavioral science, you need to have that experimental approach, and you need to be willing to test things out, to try things to see if they work.
Mm-hmm. So it seems like, and you're in good company as a sort of, I'm fairly dogmatic in my view of behavioral science, and in particular the science part. Not surprising, I have my own biases as a trained scientist, but it raises important questions that have come up a few times in the show with past guests, which is like, what do we call ourselves? Are we? And you touched on this. There's the behavioral scientist versus the behavioral practitioner versus the behavioral economist, and now what I'm seeing is the behavioral designer. And for whatever reason, that term has caught on more in North America than I
Mm,
think where you are in the UK. I think in the UK there is this emphasis on the science part, maybe because it's sort of where it all started, where it all began, and with the behavioral insights team. So what are your thoughts around the whole behavioral design and the behavioral blank meeting design thinking? And I'm not sure if you guys think about this in,
mm,
BVA.unit, but where does the science part end and the design slash artsy part begin, if
mm.
it does?
Yeah, good question. So I think one of the reasons maybe why there's that difference between the approach in North America and the UK is because, and this is one of the things I wanted to address in the book, is that a lot of the best practice that we look to, particularly in the UK, I think has been, what's been done in the public sector, and obviously that's the background that I have.
Mm,
So I refer to that work quite a lot. But actually, I think potentially in North America, a lot of the best practice that you're looking towards is more in the technology sector, and particularly,
mm,
the learnings from Silicon Valley. And so, for me, I'm fortunate in that I guess I've kind of had an experience which was a mix of the two, which was when we developed the My Quit Buddy app in Australia, which was to help people quit smoking. It was funded by government, so it was a public initiative, but obviously being app-based technology and kind of relatively early in the days of adoption of apps in 2012 when it was launched. Um, it was a technological solution. So we were kind of merging the two approaches, if you like, there, and bringing in a lot of the best practice that I'd learnt around behavioural science, but also specifically in the world of anti-tobacco, that into the technology world. And the real learning experience for me was around the use of behavioral insights in a minimum viable product, or MVP approach, which is what
mm,
we adopted for that. In fact, the reason we had a MVP approach for building the app was because the Minister for Health had a primetime TV slot booked on World No Tobacco Day, and she wanted to have something to talk about, and that was 8 weeks away, and we already had the proposal for the app, for developing the app, My Quit Buddy app, in place. And the minister said, "Okay, I want to talk about that on TV, so let's sign that off." And that meant that we had 8 weeks to build the thing and get it into the app store.
wow.
And so by necessity, we basically had to build the minimum possible functionality,
Hmm.
such that we could have something launch on that day. But with hindsight, it was exactly the right way to do it, which was that we took some of the evidence base around what works in quitting smoking, but also what works in technology. Built a limited functionality version of the app, released that into the App Store. As a result of the minister talking about it on primetime TV, we got quite a big initial cohort of users downloading the app, and then we used the data and feedback on how they were using the My Quit Buddy app to make that more effective. And that's very much that kind of test and learn approach. But it's
Hmm.
also, it's how Silicon Valley technology companies work. They release things in beta and then they refine from there.
Hmm.
And that was, so we were kind of, without knowing it, I would say we were following that playbook, if you like.
Early on too. You said 2012.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And the brilliant thing about that is that, for that very reason, is that the app is still in use and still going strong now in
Hmm.
2020. So it's been used by over 500,000 smokers in Australia. The quitting success rate's 8 times what you would
Wow.
get just by going sort of cold turkey. And by my estimates, it's between 1 in 3 and 1 in 4 smokers in Australia have used the app to help them quit smoking.
Wow.
So it's
Wow.
been
That's big.
possibly to date. Yeah, absolutely. It's by that measure, it's possibly the most effective stop smoking intervention they've ever used. And it's actually the product's now being, or the app's been white labeled and used by governments around the world. So, so I mean, for me, that was a really interesting insight in terms of, I guess, to answer your question about the difference between behavioral designer and behavioral scientist, or whatever terminology. I'm not one to get too hung up on terminology around this. I guess the role I played in developing that app was to say, okay, this is what the best practice behavioral science tells us around smoking in particular. And then we worked with a really skilled design agency called the Project Factory, who then turned that into the functionality of the app. So, if you were to ask me tomorrow to build an app, I couldn't do that. But what I could do is advise on best practice around integrating behavioral science into user experience. And that's a lot of the work that I do at BVA Nudge Unit, is around using and applying best practice in behavioral science to develop better products, services, customer experiences, but working with designers, technologists, and so on to do that. So I guess it probably comes down less to your definition of behavioral and more to your definition of a designer. Would you classify that work as being a designer? Probably not. And that's why I kind of more often refer to myself as a consultant.
Now for a short breather, a moment of calm reflection to discuss some housekeeping items. For newcomers to the show this week and last, welcome to the community of behavioral practitioners and budding behavioral enthusiasts. You can find all episodes on your usual podcatcher programs, as well as on the website www.behaviorist.biz/BS podcast. For any direct feedback, comments, or questions, you can always reach out to me personally at nhbehaviorist@gmail.com. And remember to subscribe on iTunes Podcast or wherever else you get your podcast fix. And if you're feeling up for it, and if you have a couple of minutes to spare, I'd really appreciate a rating and review to help spread the BS love and grow our behavioral community. I'd also like to let you know that our show's guest today, Richard, has an upcoming podcast to accompany the new book. Richard's podcast, the Behavior Business Podcast, features excerpts from interviews with over 20 different experts to get the latest and best insights on the amazing work they're doing applying behavioral science around the world. You can find the link in the show notes, and be sure to subscribe to Richard's show. Now that's it. Back to the show and the illustrious Richard CHATAWAY. You touch on like the collaboration piece of the behavioral person, whatever you want to call them, working with the developer, the dev team, working with the UX designer, the UI designer, front end, back end. Just yesterday, or maybe the day before, working with a client, and I was informing them of building an app, and I was informing them of all the content that needed to go in there from a psychometrics and a science perspective. And then we were working on some very basic data visualization and sort of the reports that the users would get at the end of this journey that they go through. It's sort of a behavior change thing. And I had put together these very rough reports that, as I said, the users would see. And then I shared it with the group. And to talk about the curse of knowledge, like the lead team they were saying, this is a good start, Nick, but this is terribly uninterpretable from like just the average person. Mm-hmm. And I sort of had to ask, I had sort of a check. I was like, you're right. This is like, I get it, but like it's my knowledge because I get it. It's that reason. So, and then we sort of continued talking and brainstorming some ideas, and it was the lead developer on the team said, oh, I know about this, and this, and it's sort of a good way to show and visualize data so that the user can understand, and we'll run it past this UX person, and they will do a way better job than I could have ever done. So I think it's testament to different strengths and different people's backgrounds all coming together on a shared purpose and a shared job of producing this one product and bringing it to market. So I think we're in a time now, like 5-10 years ago, behavioral scientists or behavioral practitioners would have been much more holier than thou and pretend as if they had all the answers. I think we're learning quickly that that's certainly not the case, and the best way forward is to be working together with other experts.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, one of the things that I say, I often say, and I've got in my book, is that um, I think the difference between, if you're looking at the difference between what you would get from working with a behavioral scientist or behavioral science consultancy versus a more traditional, maybe management consultancy firm, is that when you brief a management consultancy firm and ask them to for a solution to a problem or to address a business problem, that you would get a 500-page report which advocates one solution. Whereas I think if you work with a behavioral scientist, a true behavioral scientist who believes in the scientific method, what you'll get is a 10-page report with 10 potential solutions. But what we're saying is we'll test those 10 to find out what works.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
and I think that's both a huge advantage, but it's also a challenge in the sense of that it's easier to charge a lot of money for a 500-page report because you can see the volume of work that's gone into it.
Hmm.
Um, and a 10-page report, it's harder to charge those kind of equivalent prices because it looks like there's not been as much work that's gone into it. But what has
Especially
gone
when you say, well, here's the 10, but really one's only going to work, but we're going to
into
test it. Oh, and the way that we're going to test it is we're going to spend more of your money and make you wait 6 months,
yeah, yeah.
but we promise you the one is going to really work.
But
And
the gains from that one that works could be absolutely huge, and
and
that's
that's
that.
that's the crux of it, right? That's the
Yeah,
communication of the ROI and the convincing the external stakeholder or this person that to trust the process, to trust the scientific method. But it's not
absolutely.
easy, and I think that's the challenge for us now. I'm realizing more and more, and that's how we um, sort of differentiate ourselves from, say, the McKinseys, the Bains, and the BCGs. These the classic strategy management consulting firms, and even I'm curious what your take is on that.
Mm,
Because I've noticed the like all of them actually, the MBBs, all three have now built these in-house quasi behavioral BEBI
yeah.
groups. So I think they see it's important, but I think they're just trying to still maintain their dominance in the market.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's a couple of interesting aspects to that, and the fact that, as you say, those businesses are now building their own behavioural functions. I think, to my mind, their existing business models have been built on a certain way of working, and it's worked very successfully for them.
Mm.
So I think that oil tanker is going to take a while to turn around, if you see what I mean. In terms of, I can't see them ever adopting a more kind of, whilst they're going out and preaching this to their clients to some degree in terms of sort of agile processes and so on. I think in terms of their own ways of working, it's going to be very difficult to change and to adapt to that. And in fact, there's a McKinsey report that I quote in the in my book, which is around, which says that the use of behavioural insights in businesses, it says to the effect that that's about how you situate it within the organisation. And in fact, I think what those businesses are actually primarily advocating is that behavioural scientists should sit within a business rather than be sought externally. And
Hmm.
and I can kind of see the argument for that. I would say that for most businesses, they still don't have the knowledge or appetite to do that, and that's why they work with consultancy businesses like the one I work for.
Hmm.
But I think the other aspect of it as well is that I've done a number of projects myself, working in partnership with consultancy businesses, although admittedly not some of the big names that you mentioned. And what's been very interesting about that is that when working with specialist consultancy businesses who understand their sector and who understand their approaches, and particularly those who are kind of, the management consultancy world, they're very focused on efficiencies typically and gaining
Hmm.
efficiencies for business, and they're using processes like Kaizen and Lean and Agile and those kind of
Hmm.
approaches. There is actually a kind of natural fit and a natural synergy with some of the work that I do in terms of applying behavioral science. So to give you one example, we were working with a bank here in the UK. They were looking to deliver some efficiencies through their call center. So their the call center for answering customer queries and dealing with customer requests. And the one of the things that they noticed was that the calls in the call center were taking a lot longer than they needed to. Or their perception was that they were not being very efficient in handling calls from customers, which obviously is bad from a customer viewpoint, because ultimately when we call the bank, all we want is our query resolved successfully. If we're making a deposit or we're seeking to withdraw money, we want that done as quickly as possible so we can get on with the rest of our day.
Mhm.
No one, frankly, no one likes spending more time on the phone to the bank than they need to. So there was that was the efficiency goal, but also perversely there was a kind of there was a customer experience aspect to it, which was that the length of the call inversely correlated with customer satisfaction.
Mhm.
So the fact that calls were taking too long was costing the bank money, and leading to inefficiencies for them, but also it was leading to a worse customer experience. And so what I was brought in to do specifically was to incorporate nudges into the language and the scripting and the conversations that were happening between people in the call center and customers, to both decrease the length of those calls, but also lead to a better outcome and a better experience for customers.
And was that, just to clarify, is that nudging the person, the call center person, employee, with
Yes.
scripting, or telling them to, like, equipping them with the knowledge of nudging to nudge the customer?
Well, both actually, really. In that,
Oh,
in that, what we did was we looked at the scripting. So some of the scripts were mandated. There are certain things that, for
mhm.
legal reasons, but also just from best practice viewpoint, were scripted. And there were some aspects where the customer service representatives were able to improvise, for want of a better word. Um,
Hmm.
and what we did was we looked at the scripts. We also we did a lot of call listening. So we listened to lots of calls to kind of get an understanding of the kind of things that the customer service representatives were saying, and also what the customers were saying in response to that. And then from that developed a list of interventions that we wanted to pilot. And then we developed resources, scripting, and training for a subset of the total population of agents in the call center, for them to trial, and to be part of a trial. And those people in the trial group were selected at random. They were representative of the total population. They weren't good performers and they weren't bad performers. They were kind of a mix. And over the course of the trial, so we trained them in these techniques. Also, one critical insight for this particular project was actually it was much more effective to work with the people within our trial group to develop the scripts,
Hmm.
rather than, as behavioral scientists, us to sit down and rewrite them on our own. Because some of these people have been working in this call center for a number of years and they had great experience and insight into, in addition to the call listening that we've done. But the
Mhm.
other as well is that one of the critical things for us was it had to sound natural. It had to sound like everyday conversation. If it sounded overly scripted or it sounded clunky, the language that they were using, then that would limit effectiveness as well. And over
Mhm.
the course of the pilot, we were able to refine some of the scripts based on the feedback from the people in the call center to say, actually, I think it would work better if you switch this word to switch this word out, or change the ordering of words here.
Hmm.
And it worked incredibly well. And over the course of the pilot, we found that the average duration of calls with our pilot group was 11% shorter than it was with the rest of the population in the contact center, the call
Hmm.
center. And considering this is a bank with 20 million customers, or 20 million plus customers, handling thousands of calls a day, the efficiency savings from that were absolutely huge. I mean, literally
Hmm.
into the millions of pounds.
Hmm.
And in fact, before we'd even finished the pilot, the client had said to us, "We want to start rolling this out to the rest of our staff in the
Hmm.
contact center."
Hmm. Hmm.
Because the effects we were seeing were huge. And I think that one interesting insight from that is it is not the most robust experiment in the world. I can't tell you in isolation the impact of the different interventions because we weren't able to do that. It wasn't a randomized controlled trial, in that sense.
Mhm.
But I think what's interesting and the thing to bear in mind when we talk about behavioral science in business is that in this particular case, to be honest, the client didn't care. We were delivering an overall benefit and an overall impact in effectiveness, which was the goal that the management consultancy who I was working with was delivering. And the fact whether that was being delivered by the new processes and systems and back end work that they were doing, or it was the scripting, and we were able to isolate the impact of the scripting versus some of the other
Hmm.
interventions, but they didn't really care. They just wanted an overall improvement,
Hmm.
and obviously, and they wanted a positive ROI from the project,
Hmm.
and that's what we delivered. And so, I guess to my point earlier about the importance of experimentation and testing, we were experimenting, we were testing through a controlled trial, but it wasn't to the standard that would be able to publish this in an academic journal. It wouldn't get through peer review in terms of the robustness of the effect. What we do know is that overall there was an 11% improvement, efficiency
Hmm.
improvement.
I think there are, and I'm more convinced of this than I've ever been. That I think it's probably because the longer I'm outside of, formal basic research in academia, is that there are degrees of sort of testing. There's a gradient of testing, and there's the one end where we have less empirical or methodological control, where it's maybe it's correlational survey design, and then you have quasi experimental all the way to the total extreme end, which is true double blind crossover procedure randomized control trial, blah blah, sort of like clinical trials. um, but at each point along that gradient, uh, every approach and every method has its merit, because it's always a trade-off between feasibility and cost on the one hand versus the confidence in what's being discovered and what's being communicated on the other.
Mm.
And even and I do see that's changing even in that, like you said, with academic journals. They used to think that everything had to be, at least this is, I mean, I'm talking about psychology here in particular, that everything had to be a true experiment, an experimental test. um, but that's changing, especially as psychologists and behavioral scientists are like leaving in droves, the leaving the academy to come into the quote unquote the real world, into the wild. Or equally, you have the academics who are staying in the university institutions, but they're actually asking, I wonder if this theory that I've had and been an expert on and have written about for the last 20 years, I wonder if this actually holds up outside of the laboratory. And so they're
Mm.
going to running field experiments. But when you run a field experiment, you have to lose some, there's going to be some loss of rigor. But of course, what you gain is ecological validity. You gain the knowledge that this thing will or will not hold in the real world. And that's just as important as the internal validity of, controlling for all the third variables by running tests in a lab. One isn't better than the other. And I think the social psychologists from my world are starting to realize that, and sort of they need to get off their high horse, if you guys are listening.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I appreciate it's much easier for me to say that as a practitioner, as someone who's been applying this in the real world and hasn't come from the academic background. It's easy for me to, it's easy for me to advocate not being on that high horse, as you say. Because obviously there is a need, as in any field of human endeavor, there's a need for rigor, there's a need for academic excellence in order to ensure best practice. So I think it is a difficult uh, it's a difficult balance to strike. I
Mhm.
appreciate that. But I think there is also I think one other thing I would say about this, which is really important, is that what my own work is, what I've seen in my own work, and I think is consistently shown in the world of behavioral science and applying behavioral science in the real world, as you say, is that it's very, very context dependent. And therefore, for me, the essence of where the scientific approach is most critical in the business world is recognizing that actually, yes, what works for another business may not work for yours. And therefore, that you do have to test in your own context in order to understand exactly what is effective. I mean, to give you an example of this, we did some projects when I was in a previous role where we worked with two different call centers. Both of them were subscription based products. So one was a newspaper, one was a software product. The call center, one of the objectives of the call center was that when people called up to cancel their subscription, then the people working the call center would try and dissuade them from doing so, or give them an alternative
Mhm.
subscription package to try and retain them as customers. So it was a retention objective. And in both cases, we tried exactly the same intervention, which was effectively a social norms framing, where we said other customers like you have found this package very popular, as a way of persuading them to take up an alternative package offer. With the newspaper, that proved to be over 200% more effective than the control condition in terms of retaining customers, which was an astonishing result.
Mm.
With the software product, it proved to be less effective than the control. There was actually a backfire effect on it.
Mm.
And it was this same wording, the same language, everything was the same as an intervention.
Why do you
And
suspect there was the backfire with the software?
yeah, so I think I can only hypothesize this, so we've no way of verifying this, but I think the reason why that was if you think about a newspaper, um, the nature of a newspaper is that it's your, it's your window on the world, if you like. It informs your worldview. There probably is quite a strong in-group effect in terms of, associating with that newspaper and associating with other people like you who read that newspaper. And so,
Mm.
therefore, in that context, using social norms is very effective. Whereas the software product, and this was a software product that was primarily used by small businesses, sort of independent designers and people like that. Um, I suspect in that context, saying other people like you are behaving in a certain way doesn't have the same effect, because in business, what you're seeking is competitive advantage. So, and you're seeking to some extent to differentiate yourself from everyone else. So, by saying other people like you have found this package very popular, possibly doesn't have the same effect. In fact, as we saw, it has a negative impact. I can't I can't verify that. I can't back that up. It's just a hypothesis, but
Mhm.
that was my theory as to why that happened.
It's reasonable. It is, and it gets back to this point that there's not a one nudge to rule them all, as
Yes,
they
yeah,
say, which is good for us because if it was, I think we'd all be out of a job
yeah.
because then
Everyone would be doing it. Yeah,
they'd just be rolling out this one, or even if there's like five, then business leaders could easily just roll them out at scale. But
yeah.
thankfully for us, there's some nuance associated with the work we do. Right. One final question, if you don't
Everything's
mind.
complicated. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That's what you start off every client conversation with, right? Everything's complicated. So one final question: the BBB, the Big Behavioral Brainstorm. So in today's businesses and society in general and politics, lots of problems are floating around, and we're all trying to sort of desperately come up with a solution. Which one in particular problem, I mean, do you see could benefit the most from a behavioral science type intervention?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, well, it's a big question. I think for me, one of the things I did with the book, and one of the reasons, or one of the ways in which I wanted to approach the book and to sort of demonstrate the importance of behavioral science in the business world was to cover off multiple different challenges in business, and say, these are the key challenges facing businesses today, and this is where behavioral science, I think, gives us a better toolkit, for want of a better word, in terms of addressing those. But there's one challenge, I guess, that I focus on in the book, which is one that isn't just, I guess, a challenge for business, but a challenge for society in general. And that's really around automation and increasing use of automation and AI, and I'm not an expert in those areas, but I do feel that that behavioral science does give a much better framework and toolkit for addressing those problems. And I guess when I first started sort of thinking about it and realizing, I guess, the relevance of behavioral science for addressing those problems of automation and AI, and they were all well documented. Whether it comes to how do we get people to, or how do we get people to start using self-driving cars, for example. When that loss of autonomy and control that's involved with that, versus the fact that if we are increasingly using automation in the business world, then that could potentially lead to mass unemployment,
Hmm.
and solutions related to that. For me, the kind of light bulb moment around that was when I was at a conference in New York in 2016, and I saw Daniel Kahneman being interviewed there, and he came up with this great quote about it, because someone asked him a question about, what is the role of behavioral economics, behavioral science, in a world where we're increasingly delegating decisions to algorithms and using algorithms and
Hmm.
algorithmic-based tools such as AI and so on. And he said, the difference between a human and an algorithm is that you feed the same data into an algorithm twice, you'll get the same answer. This is not true of humans. And for me, I was just like, well, as typically for Daniel Kahneman, that's a brilliantly insightful and pithy way to put the problem. But also, for me, I was like, wow, that's absolutely hit the nail on the head. And if one looks at the challenges that we're facing as a society and as businesses around automation, the solutions that are being proposed are for challenges in business that are um, easily replicable, or can be easily replicated and resolved by use of an algorithm. Basically, they're the simple problems of business that relate to quality control and
Mm,
repetitive, simple processes. The benefit of having robots building cars in a car factory is that it produces it to the same standard every time, and it does it faster and more efficiently than a human does. That's a huge benefit to the business, and actually a huge benefit to a consumer, because you're not prey to the whims and inconsistencies of humans
mm,
in building those products. Where it doesn't work is those human to human interactions and products and services that rely on some of those non-rational drivers of behavior, you know understanding of empathy, for example. And when you look at the jobs that are least at risk of automation, they are primarily jobs in healthcare and education, for example, where
mm,
those kind of softer, more empathic skills are required. And the reality of that is that what it means is that if this drive towards automation continues, that the only jobs that are left for humans to do in our economy are ones that require those softer skills,
mm,
and by necessity have a psychological foundation to them. So that if you are an employer of people, then being a being a behavioral business is only going to become more and more important.
mm,
And having that understanding of these non-rational drivers of behavior is going to be an essential. It's not a nice to have, because the only way that you will get the best performance out of the people in your business, and if you're a government, the only way that you're going to keep your people happy, is by having an understanding of those more psychological drivers of behavior.
mhm, mhm.
Because that's what the reality of life will be if we continue along this path.
Yeah.
So, so I think and that's where you get into really interesting discussions around things like universal basic income, and and ensuring that one of the things that behavioral science tells us is very interesting in terms of organizational behavior is about the limitations of the traditional motivators of people in business, particularly pay. We know that pay is actually very limited in its efficacy as a motivator for people.
Mhm.
And so you need to start looking at some of these more psychologically based motivations, and looking at other incentives to get the best out of people. And I think so for me, all of those things are kind of interrelated, in that when our instincts are that as technology becomes more important and starts doing more and more of the jobs that humans used to do, our instincts are, well, we better get a better handling of the technology. I would argue exactly the opposite. We need to get a better handling of humans and what drives humans, because the technology will look after itself.
I really like that. That's well, a good answer. It's
Thank you.
I've never thought of never really thought this, the what might be actually an inverse correlation between as technological advancements and the automation of products and services with the need to understand behavior. So I think you're right. I suspect you're right that as we develop more and more on the tech side, that will take care of the things that it can take care of. But I think the whole behavior and the psychological part will continue. We've seen it rise, but I think it will continue to rise, and maybe that actually helps explain. And I've talked about this before. It's like, why the behavioral revolution now? Why 2010 with all the books that came out, like Dan's and Richard and Cass's, like why all those books now? And I think maybe one factor that I haven't heard, and maybe we should start talking about is because of what's going on with technology. It's because of automation, and maybe it's sort of forcing us to consider, and forcing the businesses and leaders to consider the non-tech, if you will, which is the psychological, is what
And,
what I think is true.
and I would argue as well, and this is one of the things I argue in my book, is that if you look at the most successful technological companies of the last 20 years, in the 21st century, what has driven their success more than anything else has been an understanding of the psychological drivers of behavior, an understanding of some key behavioral science principles, and then being able to experiment at speed and scale to verify those more than it has technological innovation. When Google launched in 1998, it wasn't the first search engine. It wasn't even in the top 50, in the first 50. But what differentiated Google as a search engine was the simplicity of its interface and the way that it presented the search results to users. In terms of, there was one search bar and two buttons, Google search and I'm feeling lucky, which is still the fundamental of the interface now. Whereas if you remember back in those days, there was, if you were using Alta Vista or Yahoo or any of those others, it was incredibly cluttered interface. There were buttons all over the place. It was very cognitively effortful to use those other search engines. If you used Ask Jeeves, for example, you actually had to type in a question. You couldn't just say what's the capital of Alabama. You had to say you couldn't just say capital of Alabama. You had to say what is the capital of Alabama ? To get your search result. I mean, it was just in terms of cognitive effort, Google was just such a better solution. And it's and then what they've been able to do is then use the data that they have to just continually optimize and verify that. In much the same way as we did with my Quit Buddy, as I mentioned earlier. And so it's that to me was one of the kind of insights that drove me in terms of writing the book, was the understanding that actually what sets those companies apart is the way they use behavioral science as part of developing the best possible user experience. It's not that they are particularly technologically innovative as companies.
Very good. Well, that's a great wrap, I think. Richard, thanks so much. It's a pleasure to talk with you about everything and the book, and it's Friday at the end of the week of your first book launch. So I think it's high time for you to celebrate.
I will definitely be having a drink. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Hey, Nick here once more. A final farewell note before ending. All the show notes, links to papers, resources, and materials mentioned in the episode can be found on the BS Podcast page of The Behaviorist, where you can find all episodes and lots of other interesting, easy-to-apply, sciencey stuff. Just go to www.behaviorist.biz/BS podcast. And lastly, if you'd like to join me in the mission of spreading the good BS word, remember to rate and review the show on iTunes. Why should you? Because 1, you're a part of a digital-wide social proof exercise. 2, you're helping combat the negativity bias in the form of positive reviews. And 3, it's a little pre-commitment for your habitual podcast listening. A little investment to keep you coming back for more BS. I mean, how much more behavioral can you get? Thanks again for listening. Until next time, remember, keep your facts ugly and your hypotheses beautiful.